Now, I need to say to begin with that my talk isn't going to be all love and light and flowers and space brothers and benevolent beings. Because in my last 7 years of being president, I've encountered a lot of different stories from a variety of people, and some of them are quite traumatic. And I'm going to begin with to give you a sort of an insight into the history of major insights that have been published. Starting with Bigelow. Do you know of Robert Bigelow? Right. Robert Bigelow is the head of Bigelow Aerospace, and he works incredibly in secret most of the time. Most of us wouldn't know what he's doing, but he collects an enormous database of UFO contact stories, sighting reports. I think the government feeds him with some of the sightings that they receive, that their pilots have seen. So what Bigelow said recently to Lara Logan of 60 Minutes America, he said, "ETs walk amongst us, and I don't care if people think I'm crazy." So what is that saying? If he is saying ETs walk amongst us, and he generally doesn't reveal much at all, then we know for a fact that they are walking amongst us. He spends 290 million of his own money he has spent on this phenomenon. He's fascinated by it. He also bought Skinwalker Ranch. Have you heard of Skinwalker Ranch? Now, there's a book called The Hunt for Skinwalker. And in that book, they discuss the ranch in Utah where people who've lived there have experienced the weirdest, strangest phenomenon. Portals would open up in front of them, and strange creatures would climb out of the portal. What also happened with a couple who were called the Shermans, who used to live there, is they found 14 of their cattle mutilated on the property. They've even found animals shifted from one location to another location, and they don't know how they got there. So there's a strange vortex possibly on Skinwalker Ranch, and Bigelow owns it. So it's quite interesting. He's a man, I wish he'd speak out, but he's extremely quiet about it all. Now, I thought I'd mention this, even though it's channeled information, and normally I'm not that keen on channeled information. I'm a bit wary of it. But Marshall V.N. Summers channeled the book, The Allies of Humanity, apparently from a collective of alien races watching over the Earth. And they were extremely concerned because of the dark forces that had taken over the planet. And so what he said, what he channeled from them, and this is their message to the people of Earth. You live in a world with a remarkably temperate environment and tremendous biological beauty and diversity. You live in a world that has enormous water resources. You live in a world that has large tracts of habitable land for those races that can breathe your atmosphere. You have a world now that has a human presence and infrastructure that can be incorporated into foreign technologies. You have a race of people who are intelligent, although superstitious, and ignorant of life in the universe, thus making them malleable and susceptible to persuasion and inducement. You have a virtual paradise. This is how your world is perceived by those out there. And so, like in the Avatar movie, what humans do if they went to another planet, can you imagine, in our current state? It would be conquer, use the resources for whatever way we feel like using them. We torture, kill, and eat our animals. So why would an advanced species not see us as the same sort of resource? And some of them might, in fact, do that. So this is what the Allies said further. At this moment, the intervention has few critics, but if enough people can become aware of it and speak out against it, the intervention will be thwarted and must withdraw. This is the first step in humanity's preparation for dealing with the realities of life in the universe. This step and all the steps that follow give humanity its one great chance to overcome its long-standing conflicts and to unite in its own defense for the preservation of this world. They emphasize that we as human beings have the spiritual and collective power to do this, and that we must do this if we want to survive and advance as a free and independent race in the greater community. So I thought that was quite powerful, given with all the negative stuff that's happening on this planet. Now, many of you know about the paperclip scientists who went from Nazi Germany to America and ended up in NASA and in the CIA. Now, Maria Orsich was a German medium who in the 1930s decided to channel a group of beings from the Aldebaran system in the Taurus system. Her aim was to eventually be able to leave this planet, build a spacecraft, and travel to another planet. That was her aim. She wanted to do it for peaceful purposes. She was one of the Vril maidens, or Vril women, and on one side of that slide you can see a woman with very long hair. The Vril women believed that if they grew their hair long, they could act as antenna to communicate with extraterrestrial beings. That was their belief. Maria Orsich met Rudolf Hess, whom, as you know, is one of the Nazi SS, while they both belonged to the Thule Society. And she told him of her plans, and of course he communicated that to Hitler. Hitler became very interested in the space project and building spacecraft, advanced craft. He wanted to use them for the war effort. She wanted to use them for peaceful purposes. So she did, in fact, channel in two different languages, ancient Sumerian and German, a German Templar language. And what happened when they were translated, she couldn't understand what she was channeling. When it was translated, they were the prototype, the plans for a spacecraft. So thousands of people within the group gave money, and they in fact did develop a spacecraft. And at the end of her life, or I shouldn't say the end of her life, at the end of World War II, she completely vanished off the face of the earth with her group, and some believe that she took off for Aldebaran. The Nazis, of course, that was the end of that story. They developed their technology as well through the help of the Draco reptilian race. Now, according to stories, and I'm not sure how true this is, Heinrich Himmler developed the Society of the Black Sun, a secret society, and they channeled the Draco reptilians. And so that's where the involvement with the reptilian order started, and in fact the reptilians showed them the Antarctica area as a secret base, which is what some people say Hitler disappeared to the Antarctica after the Second World War. And a lot of the technology and advanced spacecraft they developed disappeared there with them. So, now Adamski, many of you know George Adamski, took the most amazing photographs in the 50s and early 60s. He was a Polish American and had a relationship, a close relationship with beings he claimed were from Venus, Mars, and Saturn, who looked exactly like us. They were humanoid. They lived on this planet, they worked on this planet, and they'd integrated into society and simply didn't tell other humans who they were. So that was going back in the 50s. He was invited to visit Queen Juliana in Netherlands and also the Pope John XXIII in Rome, and apparently was given a medal. So he was extremely well known. He toured Australia as well as the world. It was long before my time, before I was interested in UFOs. Then we get the Amachitsia. How many of you know the Amachitsia? Oh, wow, okay, not many. Very interesting story. The Amachitsia is the Italian friendship group. They operated from 1954. There were about 200 members across Europe, and they were secretly meeting with a humanoid extraterrestrial race that lived in an underground base in the Pescara region of Italy. On your right is Stefano Breccia, who wrote a book called Mass Contacts about their relationship with this group. I just want to check where the group came. They came from the third galaxy, I believe, this group of extraterrestrials. They were called the Akri, but were called the W56s by the Amicizia group. The group lasted for about 50 years, and on your left is a picture of a giant. They lived between 1 meter and 3 meters tall, and he was 9 foot tall. And it's been verified. It may not look like it on the photo, but it's actually been verified. So most of them looked humanoid, and probably the ones who were slightly shorter would have blended into our society quite easily. Charles Hall and the Tall Whites. How many of you know Charles Hall's story? Wow, okay. Now, he's an interesting man. He came and spoke in Sydney a few years ago. Charles Hall was doing military service in the Nevada desert on Nellis Air Force Base in the 60s. He was sent out to launch weather balloons in the middle of the desert. And while he was standing there one day, this white floating object came across the desert that looked like a white horse. When it got close to him, he noticed it wasn't a horse at all. It was a very tall, white, ethereal, humanoid being with thinnish white hair, larger than normal eyes, and very white skin. The Tall Whites, he discovered, had a base built for them to the tune of $300 million in the Nevada desert by the American military. They were working with the American military. They were sharing technology in exchange for having a base to come to en route to other places in the universe. Once a month, their very large motherships would bring the next crew of the Tall Whites to Earth, and the military built them scout craft so they could get around the desert. They liked heat because their planet is extremely hot. He was called Teacher's Pet by one of the senior elderly Tall Whites. They were very suspicious of humans. If any human so much as threatened them or their children, they would have killed them on the spot. They didn't trust humans. They said we were extremely violent and we treated our children very badly. So that's another case of actual extraterrestrials, physical beings living on this planet, using the Earth as a base. And the world knows nothing about this. And then, of course, we've got Billy Meier. Many of you know who Billy Meier is. Swiss citizen who also took the most extraordinary clear pictures of UFOs for decades. He's been heavily debunked by many people. He still maintains that he took those photographs. And as you can see in the picture, they look incredibly, they're not blurry at all. They look very, very clear. Now, what he's done in recent years, he communicated with a group from the Plejaren and started at age 5. At age 5, he communicated with Svarth, who was an elderly gentleman, very wise being, and he has since maintained contact with Semyasa, who is the granddaughter of Svarth. He also offered photographs, metal samples, and audio recordings. And in 1975, he established a religious organization called FIGU. And not long ago, we met some of the members of FIGU in Sydney and asked them, what does it mean to belong to FIGU? And we were told you have to pay 7% of your monthly wage to them to belong. In exchange, you get a quarterly newsletter with prophecies and predictions by Billy, as told him by Semyasa. And he claimed to be the incarnation of Enoch, Jesus, and Muhammad. So you can understand why people found some of his information a bit hard to take. Travis Walton. Most of the people in my group would certainly know Travis Walton. He is one of the most incredible experiences of anybody. He was a logger in the Apache Sitgreaves National Park in Arizona, and they were logging one day when they saw a very bright light in the forest. And Travis, being curious, said to his friends, "Let's go and have a look." And he climbed out of the truck and got too close to the object, which was floating above the ground. And a beam shot out from the object, and he was basically killed. He was knocked off his feet, lifted, flung 3 meters away, and lay there as if dead. His friends were terrified. They witnessed this. Not long after that, he disappeared. That craft picked him up, and he apparently saw humanoid beings on the craft, and for the next 5 days they healed his body. His friends had rushed back to the town, and a huge search had been launched for Travis, and they searched for 5 days, could find him nowhere. And at the end of the 5 days, disoriented, he was found on a street near his town. And he has stuck to his story ever since. He's had polygraph tests, his friends have had polygraph tests, and no one has been able to debunk this particular story. Now, I'd also just like to mention Alec Newald in New Zealand, just briefly. Alec Newald has told an incredible story of having his car lifted in a cloud off a cliff edge and into a spacecraft and taken to another planet where he spent 10 days. I'm not going to tell you that whole story, but that's also absolutely amazing. And then many of you know the story of Peter Curry, who had a sexual encounter with 2 beings in his bedroom. And Bill Chalker has examined that story in great detail, and a hair was found on the penis of Peter Curry, which was examined for DNA. And the DNA that was found was of some ancient Mongolian race. So how about that? So what I've discovered in all my research is that we are dealing, when it comes to alien contact, we are dealing with multi-dimensional races. We can no longer say it's extraterrestrials from another planet, because in fact it's turning out to be something very different. There may in fact be contact from extraterrestrials, but there's a lot of contact from right here, from an interdimensional reality right next to ours, or even superimposed on ours, but we can't see it. I'm going to do the different alien races now who are contacting humans. The most common one is the Greys, or Zetas. Some come from Zeta Reticulum system. Others are believed to have been enslaved by the reptilians. And according to Judy Carroll, who's had contact with the Greys for decades, she believes that some of them have been cloned and are being used in abductions by the reptilians. So when you see a Grey, it's not always the real, authentic guardian Greys that Judy's talking about. They could be cloned Greys, just doing a job. What's typical of the Greys is they can scan your mind and know everything about you. They can look deep into your eyes and calm you down if you're feeling fearful. They run schools on the craft, and many children, who are star children particularly, report going onto the craft and learning more there than they learn in their human schools. People are selected according to bloodline or according to blood type or genetic lines. So this is a long-term project, and we cannot consider it to be something new. This is an agenda that's probably been going on for hundreds of thousands of years. And every planet has experienced contact with extraterrestrials. And in my own opinion, there is a hierarchy. So if we're a third-dimensional race, then we've probably got fourth or fifth dimensions dealing with us. They are the gods of old, the ancient gods that came to earth to teach man. They are also, many of them, involved with upgrading our DNA and giving us a boost. As someone earlier said, we are not here due to only to the evolutionary process. We've had a helping hand on a regular basis over millennia. So at the moment, the Greys are in charge of the hybrid breeding program. And this is another very interesting facet. There are lots and lots of people reporting having hybrid children on craft. I'll get into that particular aspect a bit later. But, so that's the Greys. There are about 160 types of Greys, so one cannot put them all under one banner of all being negative. That's not the case at all. And I think it's important also to realize with all races, just as there are good humans and bad or evil humans, you get good and evil or self-serving extraterrestrials. They are master geneticists. They have a hive mentality, so you won't find the individualization with the Greys at all. They often show screens in their craft and show cataclysmic events happening that are going to happen on Earth. And the idea is that they often move the abductee to such an extent that they completely transform their life. They start caring for the earth, they start caring for the animal life. So from what I've seen from these sorts of stories, there is a transformation going on. And by shocking the human being and showing them these awful, awful situations that are going to happen on Earth, that human being is pushed beyond their current reality into accepting that they need to change. They teach advanced astronomy and physics to many of these abductees who otherwise would never have known some of the knowledge that they have. They also show the true history of Earth. Because as you know, we have been lied to on every single level on this planet. Our history, our medical system, our education system, nothing can we take at face value. They've done some miraculous healings. They also put implants in behind the ear, even in the brain and behind the eye. And sometimes these implants are so they can observe our world through our eyes. It's not necessary, sometimes it is for tracking purposes, so they can track a human being and go and find them if they need them. So people who say, oh, I moved house, I moved interstate because I wanted to get away from it, well, guess what? You ain't going to get away from it. If they want to find you, they'll find you. Aha, the reptilians. Don't you love that picture, the green one? The reptilians are a very, very powerful race. There are many factions within the reptilian race. There are, from reports, the Draco reptilians are being the elite. They come from the Draco constellation, and many believe they are running affairs on this planet. That's why we have the governments, the leaders, the corporations that we have. The Draco reptilians operate through reptoids, or hybrid human reptilians on this planet who don't necessarily look like reptilians, but they have a lot of reptilian DNA in them. And they are the ones who like the wars, the violence, the conflict, pedophilia, sexual promiscuity, sex slaves, abduction of children, torture, prostitution. A lot of that kind of energy comes from the reptilians. The debt and monetary crisis on this planet could possibly be their energy as well. They can overshadow or mind control someone to behave in ways they never would normally behave. And I'm thinking particularly of the current real crisis in the Catholic Church and the pedophilia that's so rife amongst Catholic priests. I mean, that is such reptilian energy. I heard a terrible story or watched something, I think it was 60 Minutes or the 7:30 report the other night, of priests being exposed in Philadelphia, where, did you see it? Yes, wasn't that awful? Where, priests, the poor child was being sort of yanked back so that many priests could rape her at the same time. And you sort of think, is that normal for a human being to do that? Something very weird is going on. Pedophilia is rife. I mean, the sex slave industry is rife. Children are being kidnapped in their millions. And, I mean, I don't want to be negative, but we have to face the fact this is going on. So that's the reptilians. And then we've got the Nordics, which I mentioned earlier. The Space Brothers, usually from Andromeda or from Pleiades, Venus. Tall, Scandinavian-looking, very attractive, well-built. Usually benevolent, tend not to abduct people, tend to download information telepathically, and are very concerned about what's going on the Earth at the moment. The mantids, praying mantis beings. The person who's communicated most about them is actually, what's his name? Yeah, Simon Parkes. I'm mental blank. Simon Parkes has a mother who's a green praying mantis that claims to be his mother and has been for many, many centuries, thousands of years. We have to see the mantis as an extremely advanced and ancient civilization who are very much involved with abductions through the tampering of human DNA. They go back, way back to the ancient Egyptian kingdom, the time of the Great Pyramids, and possibly even longer. They have the ability to put the abductee at ease, and they're involved in making clones, and they track bloodlines for hundreds of thousands of years, as they do with souls. So if you are a soul that has had mantid contact, then be guaranteed you have had contact with them for as long as your soul has been in existence. They prefer abducting individuals like Celtic or Romani or Jewish descent, and possibly also Native Americans and indigenous peoples of planets, of countries. What Simon Parkes says, there's an agenda to create a hybrid race that can survive on Earth after a period of depopulation, which may be coming in the not-too-distant future. He said there are going to be some very traumatic times, and we're hearing that from a lot of abductees. They are warning that things are going to get quite dangerous and serious on this planet. They like signed contracts, so they sign contracts with governments, and because America is the superpower, they have tended to sign a contract with America, thinking they represent the world. So they work with individual souls, and they often reports with mantid beings are that they are very kind, that they're very wise, and there isn't usually, apart from the initial contact where one is fearful because they look so different, most people report having, as children, seen mantids in their bedrooms. Now I want to talk about the jinn or archons, because the jinn are so prevalent in secret places on the earth as well as interdimensionally. They're an ancient parasitic race that existed before humans. They manipulate humans to behave in bizarre and immoral ways. They appear as shadow beings and can shapeshift. They often like to appear as dogs or cats or even spiders or reptilians. They can pop into our reality and walk out of it at will. They'd like to take over our planet because they feel this should be theirs, not ours. They have no respect for humans. They're frequently mentioned in the Quran, but we in the West have thought of them as demons. They appear to work with some ETs and appear to abductees often before ET contact begins, and they mimic ET contact. They are attracted to negative emotions, fear, anger, depression, drug addiction, alcoholism, anything that pulls the energy field down, the jinn are attracted. This is all the more reason we need to keep our energy fields strong and to be sovereign within ourselves and realize how powerful we are. Because as soon as you weaken that field, and people who become extremely depressed, extremely angry, absolutely heavy drug users, what you're doing is you're opening up your energy field, and these beings scan for it, and they can become attached. They feed off these emotions. Now, what else I can tell you about the jinn is they're made of smokeless fire, which we would call plasma. They appear, as I said before, like reptilians, cats or dogs, spiders, can form attachments to certain humans and actually have relationships with certain humans. And they can become extremely jealous and try to break a relationship up. They can possess humans and cause mental and physical illness. And if they refuse to leave, exorcism may be necessary. In their own societies, they marry, have families and pets, and even kings who rule them. So they have societies like we do. And Rosemary Ellen Guiley is an expert on the jinn. If you want to find out more about them, look her up. She's got some excellent talks on YouTube. She's written over 60 books, and she's got a weekly radio show. So nasty creatures, the archons, nasty. Now the shadow people. The reason I'm mentioning these other aspects too is because most contactees will report some of the weird stuff that happens around them. And this is the archon type stuff, the shadow stuff that happens. So shadow people appear in the corners of bedrooms, often wearing a trench coat and a hat, and called the Hat Man. They watch a person from the corner of the room. Usually their eyes are not visible. They seem threatening. They don't usually do anything. I've even had a report from a gentleman from the Central Coast who one day phoned me and said he was lying on his bed and he heard this rumbling above his house. And suddenly this ominous, evil feeling entered the room, and something sat on his chest, invisible. And he became paralyzed and absolutely terrified. He found he could barely breathe, and he thought this thing was strangling him. And he called out to God for help out of desperation. And the minute he did that, the thing vanished. That's what shadow beings do. They're drawn to negative energy, and a lot of people have reported weight on the bed, feeling the bed goes down. Some have even sensed heat, but there's nothing there. Or something sitting on their body, but they can feel it, but they can't see it. So those are the shadow people. They cause paralysis. A Cherokee elder believed we see them with our fifth eye, located at the top of our head, a dream eye which gives you extrasensory perception when you dream. In the dream state, you have heightened energetic sensitivity and awareness, and you're more likely to experience the supernatural. Also, if you play with a Ouija board, what are you doing? You're calling in entities, and you have no idea what you're letting in. People just play with it for the fun of it, but they don't realize they're opening vortexes and portals and letting all sorts of creatures come in. I'm going to have to speed up. Lucid dreaming is another way people experience contact. They leave their body, or their consciousness leaves their body in a dream state. And in the dream state, they are powerful. They can fly to the moon, fly to the sun, go inside the earth, do whatever they want. And some of the ET abductees report a lot of experience in a lucid dream state, but it's experienced as very real. I want to mention Jacques Vallée because Jacques Vallée is probably one of the most well-known and serious researchers into ufology. He's a French-American with an astrophysics master's and a PhD in computer science. He's one of the earliest proponents of the theory that UFOs are extraterrestrial spaceships. But by 1969, when he published Passport to Magonia, the book you see there, his assessment had undergone a significant shift. He now seemed to be backing a radical view that UFOs are paranormal in nature, and it assumes different disguises in different historical contexts. So he is now thinking that most contact is paranormal in nature and interdimensional, not from off-world. Many of you have probably looked at William Tompkins's work. He wrote the book, published very recently at age 93, Selected by Extraterrestrials. I read the book, and I must be honest with you, at the end I wanted to throw it out the window. It annoyed me so much. While he had this incredible career in NASA, he worked for Northrop, he worked in designing rockets, he worked under von Braun and Debus. Highly intelligent man, specially selected for education as a child. He believes he was telepathically communicating with Nordics who were giving him designs and giving him information. And when he worked in NASA, his secretary was believed to have been Nordic, because she would suddenly pop information into his head and he would know where he needed to go and what he needed to do. But what annoyed me was this obsession with Nordic bodies. Let's leave it alone at that. I mean, one doesn't mind reading it once, but when you're reading it 50 times, it gets a bit boring. Well, William Tompkins is one also who said that the Dracos are commanding Earth from the dark side of the moon. That the dark side of the moon, that the moon is an artificial object that was towed there and placed there, and that every planet in the solar system has a moon that's one of these command centers. So that's where the extraterrestrial races who want to control us operate from. I'm just going to have to keep going. Oh, that's Carla Turner. Right, military abductions. Now, this is probably the nasty side of abductions that most people do not want to look at or touch. Most UFO researchers avoid it like the plague. Military abductions developed out of the particularly United States wanting to find out what abductees had learnt from ETs. So what they were doing was re-abducting abductees or contactees. They were drugging them, tying them down, and forcing them to give them information. What did the extraterrestrials tell you? What technology do they have? Where do they come from? What abilities do you have? And they were testing abductees for psi abilities, psychic abilities, for intelligence, and then using them in missions and projects for the military, like Manchurian candidates. So Carla Turner and her family were abductees. They were traumatized by both ET and military experiences, and she and Barbara Bartolick spent years gathering a database together, and she spoke publicly about alien and military contact. And her belief is that it was extremely negative and not for the benefit of the human race. The book on your left was written by Helmut Lammer, an Austrian scientist who went deeply into the whole military abduction phenomenon and wrote at length about the sorts of things that happened. In terms of surveillance, I'll give you an idea, a personal story, not my own, but someone who reported to me. surveillance is well and truly occurring right here in Sydney. One fellow who's a photographer of UFOs and films an incredible number has had a white van parked outside his house watching, and the minute he comes outside the house, off it goes. He's had tradesmen coming to his house, knocking on the door and saying, "We've come to repair your burglar alarm." He doesn't have a burglar alarm. He's had black helicopters constantly flying over his house, and he's gone out there and waved at them, and the camera flash goes off from the helicopter. He has even had someone from a military base visit him incognito and show him a file that they kept on him, and in it was a photograph of every house he's ever lived in. So we know what's going on. The minute you are either a contactee or you photograph UFOs on a regular basis, you are a target. They can scan for you. They scan the person's frequency. The technology the military have is now so advanced, what they tell us is like 100 years behind what they're capable of doing. They can also put implants in, by the way, to track people. So I won't go into all the negative stuff. I mean, you get the picture. You know, they drug people, they take them into underground bases, they do all sorts of things to him. One fellow whom I spoke to, they called MyLabs. A military abductee is a MyLab. This fellow said to me that he believed he was being taken to the Snowy Mountains for a mission. They were capable of taking his soul out of his body, putting it in another body, letting him do whatever they want him to do, and then his soul was returned to his body and he was sent home in a jump room. And a jump room is like an elevator. You stand in the elevator, a green light comes on, and whoosh, you're back in your bedroom. So the technology they have is mind-blowing. That particular gentleman also told me that he believed his ex-wife was his handler. And you all know what a handler is. And often it'll be the partner who's the handler, because the partner, being close to the person, can keep an eye on them. One day his wife said to him, "We'll have to take you in for reprogramming." And it surprised him when he confronted her later and said, "Why did you say that?" She said, "I never said that." So who was beaming that into her mind, and why was she was obviously being used. I'm going to jump on. There are two American MyLab people. On your right is Melinda Leslie, on the left Nyara Isley. Briefly, both of them were taken into underground bases, military facilities, where they were drugged, interrogated, tortured, raped, whatever they want to do. And the reason they do the torture and the rape is they want to split the mind into alters. You know what an alter is. They then can program each alter so that the person has no recollection of what they've done once that alter is programmed. It's programmed by means of a code word which the handler, the controller or handler, speaks to that person. So Nyara Isley believes she was taken to the moon between 8 and 10 times. She was then raped by various reptilians who live on the dark side of the moon. She was forced to carry heavy crates, and she was also forced to do labor on expanding their military base. She uncovered some of those memories with hypnosis, because she certainly didn't remember all of it. And the same goes for Melinda Leslie. Melinda's now one of the expert speakers on the whole military abduction phenomenon. So it seems like there are various programs. There are ETs working with the military. There are military working on their own. There are reptilian-controlled plus humanoid projects where the technology of the ETs is given to the humans and they are now using the same technology. So it's a vast, vast, complicated, nefarious program, and humans are basically being used as slaves. When it comes to the regression and the hypnotherapy angle for abductees, Bud Hopkins was probably one of the most singular and important individuals. After seeing a sighting and reporting on it publicly, he received thousands and thousands of letters from people, and he realized how desperate they were to tell someone their story. He's written books like Missing Time and Intruders, and he was the one who taught David Jacobs, on your right, hypnosis. Now, why I've chosen to show those two pictures, we've got Dr. David Jacobs on the right, professor of history at... Oh, is it? Oh, sorry. I'm just looking down there and thinking I have to reverse it. Okay, sorry. So on your right, the one with the white hair. Left. Okay, so that's Dr. David Jacobs. Now, Dr. David Jacobs wrote a book called The Threat, and honestly, it was the most creepy book I've ever read. After reading it, I had to creep upstairs in the dark to bed, and I was terrified. That's how I felt. David Jacobs believed that the hybrid breeding program was designed to kind of take over the planet, and that humans were in serious danger. And he said they are going to great lengths to keep their activities a secret because they are nefarious in nature and would obviously not be supported or tolerated if discovered by the public at large. Many people want to believe that all ETs are here to help us and that the universe is filled with enlightened beings who have humanity's best interests at heart. It can be quite a shock to learn that this is not the case. They have done what they are doing on Earth to other planets, and those races have basically become enslaved as a result. It's vital that we realize this before it's too late. So that's David Jacobs. He says he fears for the future of his children. Whereas Dr. John Mack, on the other hand, has a completely different perspective on the whole thing. What he says is, you all know who Dr. John Mack is, do you? No, okay. He's a professor of psychiatry at Harvard University. And you can imagine when he started working with abductees, he was afraid he'd lose his job because his peers ridiculed and insulted him and thought he was mad. However, he saw hundreds of abductees, and what he did is he came to the conclusion that this whole phenomenon was leading towards a consciousness shift and a transformation. Which is why I want to explain what he said. A heart opening occurs, a sense of loving connection with all living beings and creation itself. Some find an intense experience of love, and their brainwave patterns, when measured, equate this to ecstasy. They become incredibly caring of the earth. They want to work in terms of preservation of nature and animals. They leave their normal working life or jobs and decide to go and live in the country. A lot of wonderful things happen to people. And what he's basically saying, in a nutshell, is the purpose for abductions and contact is to crack and shatter the human ego. Don't you like that? That humans don't change by choice. Humans only change when pushed over the brink or pushed to the edge. And so what happens with the abduction is the person is not only terrified, they are paralyzed. They are taken through walls onto craft. They are put naked on a metallic table. They have eggs and sperm taken. They have fetuses inserted into the woman's body, and after 3 months it is removed and put in a tube of liquid where it develops until it's ready to be born. Can you imagine how confronting that is? First of all, no one says, do you mind if we take your body? Do you mind if we use your eggs and your sperm? It's incredibly confronting. So the person's taken out of their current reality, everything that could be, first of all, even being naked, and you've got these bug-eyed creatures staring into your face and calming you down. They don't talk to people. They don't explain a lot. They're very silent. So you're lying there and you haven't got a clue what's going on. You have no recollection of having ever made the choice to do this. So I think he's got a point when he says it shatters the ego. Once people get through the initial fear and they reach a point of accepting that something enormous has happened in their life, they start putting the pieces of their life together, and many of them find they've reached an enormous, deep connection to Source. That's one of the things, not God as we know it with the man with a beard, but Source, an energy in the universe that's very profound and very powerful. And this happens to a lot of people who come through the terror experience. They get to the point of actually feeling this wonderful connection with Source. I've got to watch my time. How are we going? 30. Oh, good. Thank you. Right. Whitley Strieber. Whitley Strieber had a cabin in upstate New York. He was an author of horror novels. At this cabin, he was abducted by little creatures and experienced years of absolute terror, which he describes very beautifully in the book Communion. When he published the book, that face on the front cover of that book drew 10,000 letters a month from around the world. And by the time he'd finished, I suppose a few years went by, he'd had 500,000 letters of people expressing the same sort of thing. And what I wanted to do, I wanted to read to you what he said about the experience he had. Now, what he did, which was quite clever of him, he decided to confront the terror. So after getting over the initial fear, he would walk into the dark forest at night deliberately to challenge himself to overcome his fear. And this is what he said once he'd got over the fear. He came to the conclusion that the abduction phenomenon seemed to be a part of the shift in consciousness that's collapsing duality and enabling us to see that we are connected beyond the earth at a cosmic level. Our notions of the divine, like everything else, seems to grow along with the evolution of our consciousness. It's unlikely a Messiah will lead us into the divine light. This light is an eternal part of ourselves. Gosh, my voice is going. Whew, sorry. The abduction phenomenon, along with near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences, brings us where we need to go. I get some very interesting calls from time to time. One gentleman rang me from Victoria, and he said that he'd been driving his car along a rural road when two lights seemed to appear suddenly right behind his car. And he thought whoever it was being extremely careless and foolish, and he thought he was going to crash into him. Suddenly the lights lifted up and they reversed back from him at high speed. And what happened then was he became disoriented and he found himself on another road at a great distance from where he'd been. So there was missing time. After the craft departed, he had this big gap. He said he arrived home at midnight. He felt ill, nauseous, and he had no idea what had been happening in the last few hours. He could barely make a cup of tea. And the next day he went to work and still felt really peculiar. I wasn't able to go and see him, or I would have loved to have done a hypnosis session with him to find out what had happened during that time. Now, one of the very interesting experiences that was reported to me, where genetic lines often attract abduction. For example, if your mother was an abductee, then you will be one, and probably your grandmother and your grandfather. Or it runs down many generations of a particular family line. So there was a fellow in New South Wales who wrote to me that his mother and his grandmother were contactees. And I'm just trying to see where my notes are so I don't forget to say something. What had happened was his mother had had experiences with men in black, where she'd been in her house and experienced a telepathic communication from men in black, and she knew they were at the front door and they were calling her to go and speak to them. They've had surveillance. All of the family have had surveillance. Lots of black helicopters. They've had phone tamperings, clicking on the phone when they speak about UFOs or contact or ETs. The grandmother had also the same sort of thing, men in black. They would have shadow people in their homes. And this particular fellow said he had an uncle who used to talk about UFOs and extraterrestrials all the time. And what happened was one day he became a bit violent. Don't ask me why. And the police came to fetch him. And with the police were two plainclothes men in suits. And they whispered to the grandmother, everything the uncle was saying was the truth. So all the stories about UFOs and ETs, even though they thought he was crazy, he was speaking the truth. And after electric shock treatment and medication, of course, he never mentioned the subject again. This particular man has had strange lucid dreams of being in an underground base and seeing children in cages. He's also seen a reptilian with a dog lead attached to an old man around his throat, dragging the man around. Now, when you see those sorts of lucid dreams, is that a real thing, or is that a simulation, or is that something like a dream that's teaching something? But they're so real, the man felt he actually was there. Now, I want to also share with you a story I've been given permission to share by a wonderful young woman in her 30s. We'll call her Sashita. That's the name she's chosen. Now, this is an extraordinary story and may appear very far-fetched to some of you. Sashita is a woman who came to see me, who has a deep bond with a green reptilian. She believes she was born to a family who were very, very poor, and she was the only child. They were in New Zealand. Her father was religious and extremely domineering, and she knew that father had to be obeyed and father came first. So what we find is in many contactee families, often the children experience extreme torture and abuse. So what happened was the mother was very cold and distant. The father was domineering to the point of being dictatorial. So this child, Sashita, grew up very isolated. The family moved 78 times, and she was in 17 schools by the time she was 16. So there also what was set up, of course, is that she had no friends. They moved so often. But as a young child, she would talk to the animals and she would talk to Source. And when she was 3.5, she thought she'd leave home. She was so unhappy. When she was 8 or 10, she would communicate also with animals, and in 1995, her contact with reptilians started. She remembers having a soulmate on a planet which could have been Alamesh, because that's the name that she remembers. This soulmate and she were part of a blue crystalline race that were immortal and were transparent. So the soulmate they promised to be together for eternity. The soulmate looked for her because she'd incarnated onto Earth and he'd been left behind. So he would start appearing in her dreams, and she said he decided to take the reptilian form for whatever mission he was supposed to do on Earth. She only saw him in the astral, so he didn't come here in physical form. She said her people, the blue crystalline beings, lived for millions of years, and they were bonded, she and her partner, for many lifetimes. She saw him as a 7-foot green reptilian, a form he chose. He was slender, muscular with beautiful eyes and cat pupils, a snout for nose, small ears, no teeth, and 4 long fingers. What she said was the crystalline body would always remain on the mothership, and when they performed missions, they would take on a different body, depending where they were going to work. They worked for the good of all. That was their purpose. She believed she had chosen to come here to help Mother Gaia. She was very bonded to Mother Gaia and felt that she'd received a message that Mother was extremely upset with the dark energy on this planet. And so she said, we came to lift Mother Gaia off the planet. She stays connected to the planet, but she's been lifted off. And she hovers above, her spirit hovers above. They've also come to collect samples of humans, animals, and anything to do with life on this planet. What she did in her astral missions, this particular girl, she would be taken to underground bases where she was trained by the military, by this partner of hers, the military guy. So he would train her to become extremely strong, physically strong. She would fight battles. And she became so powerful that the military would leave her alone because she did see military in some of these bases. She said there are all sorts of dark creatures on the earth that live on blood and terror, and humans are losing control of their bodies. The dark force has come from the other side of the galaxy and has taken over other planets as well. The grid structure around Earth controls humans. Earth resources are being bled dry as this grid has been lowered towards the Earth. And this is why Gaia is getting ready to leave. She was shown that the Earth will become a barren wasteland in 50 years' time. But however, time does not mean what we think it does. So 50 years might be 500, might be 5,000. Her home race was able to terraform planets, and they oversee many universes and dimensions and the development of races. They work closely with the Creator. She said she saw scout ships also with grey beings on them. And the blue crystal body is a special body. They don't eat and they don't sleep. They imbibe the energy from the cosmos. That's how they live. They like silence. They spend a lot of time in silence. They don't listen to music. They meditate a lot. I asked her why she why she had a reptilian soulmate. I said, what did she learn? She learned because she put out a request to find out the truth about the universe and how it works and to master herself. She says that she was taught to do interdimensional travel as a young 2.5-year-old, and she would heal animals. Her reptilian soulmate helps her dump negative energy, to cleanse her energy field on a regular basis. She believes that input produces output, and she doesn't watch television or negative news or reports of dark agendas on Earth, since she believes in keeping her focus on what she can do to bring change. Humans have within them all the resources and solutions they need to solve their problems. Many are lazy and expect someone to come and rescue them. You know, where are the ETs that should be coming to help us? She says accountability for self is essential, and self-control is beneficial in remaining healthy and strong. So what you eat, what you put into your body, is what's going to come out of your body. The consciousness shift does not come first. She says humans need to get their shit together. That was what she said. You need to get your shit together, which I think is pretty appropriate. Before consciousness changes, each individual can only work on themselves to create change. We are far more than we currently understand. We are receiving a lot of help from benevolent ETs, but we tend to focus on what's wrong on the earth, not what's good on the earth. Now, I liked her story, and if you saw her, she's a very powerful, strong soul. She isn't a victim. People can either choose to be victims or they can choose to be powerful and strong. And while I was doing some of this research to do with how can people who have been messed with by jinn and by shadow entities and by all sorts of things, if you make your energy field strong enough and powerful enough, and you can express positive anger towards whatever being is messing with you, they can't come near you. You know, we don't realize how powerful we are. We just need to expand our energy and stand firm in our sovereignty. And I don't think anything will touch us if we're like that. It's only when you're weak that things can attach and bother you. Now, Jane Pooley, you probably know, appeared on Ita Buttros's Studio 10 program. Did any of you see it? Right. Jane Pooley has 3 hybrid children on a craft, and she has a very deep bonded relationship with them. And she openly speaks about them, and she's written a book called Humalian, which is about the hybrid children. I was really surprised that Ita Buttrose interviewed Jane, and they gave her a polygraph test, and of course she passed, that she was speaking the truth. So there's an idea of positive relationship with hybrid children, because when the hybrid children are born, the mother, the Earth Mother, is often taken onto the craft to bond with the children because they need that emotional contact and warmth, because the grey aliens are fairly emotionless. They don't have, I think that's one of the lessons on this earth. We're learning to deal with a lot of emotion. You know, extreme anger and extreme love. We're a whole mixed bag. Whereas aliens tend to be more neutral. They don't have our emotional depth. So while Jane had this wonderful relationship with her hybrid children, I had a report from a woman who was extremely angry about having been used as a womb for hybrid children. And she said to me, I'm so angry with them. I've got lots of hybrid children on the craft, and they've not allowed me to have one living child on earth. She's had endless gynecological problems. See, that's one of the negative side effects of the hybrid breeding program, is women have gynecological problems, kidney problems. They often have things like fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue. There are lots of health issues. It's unfortunate, but that's how it is. I wanted to tell you a story about someone in Sydney who told me of her MyLab experiences. Now, how are we going for time? 10? I'm just having a little scan and trying to think whether I should tell that story. What? 15, okay. What do you think? Okay. Shall I give it to you? Because it's not positive. Okay. All right. Here we go. This woman came to see me, and she's had really ongoing, very negative experiences with military. She's not, we spoke mainly about that. Obviously, she's also an alien contactee who's been re-abducted by the military. But what she was telling me was about her reptilian, not her reptilian, sorry, her military experiences. She said lots of samples have been taken from her. And since menopause, she wakes up with a dry eyeball. And she believes that her eye has been taken out. Now, others have reported that. I'm not sure if they do that to put an implant behind the eye or why they do it. She wakes up flat and emotionless, like a zombie. She feels she is disturbed a lot at night and she doesn't sleep well. She's woken up with half her face red, as if she's been burnt by radiation. She's also woken up with scratches. Scratches, now that could be reptilian. I've had reports of people waking up with long scratches on their back, and sometimes of 4-finger handprints imprinted into the leg. I've actually received photographs of that. I've also had photos shown me of a triangular 3 red dots within a bruise on the thigh of a man. Now, what one doesn't know is that a vaccination type injection thing given, or is it a sample being taken? Not sure. Anyway, to carry on about this woman, she's had genetic samples taken from her, and her blood group is O negative. Now, it seems that the majority of abductees come from the negative blood group. The negative blood group, the Rh negative, is the extraterrestrial input into our DNA genetics, which I find very interesting. The Rh positive is more a planetary-based blood group. The negative has had a lot of tampering with DNA, ET-DNA. So she's O negative. She's also very psychic. That's another phenomenon with abductees. They're extremely psychically open. The Greys with whom she had had contact worked under the reptilians. There were also mantid beings and a tall white being with a cape. She believes the military have used her to break into computer code and computer puzzles. They are making synthetic humans, and then they get her to judge them. She's manipulated to be interested in a variety of subjects, though they stimulate her mind to be interested in dogs. And then they study her reaction to dogs. Then next minute, suddenly she's interested in tennis. And so then they study her reaction to tennis. At times she feels she's being pulled out of her body and she feels anesthetized. Some mornings she can hardly walk and she has a bloody nose due to the implants. She can feel a buzzing in her shoulder. She has even seen parasitic creatures feeding off low energy. And this woman is not aware of kind entities, only abusive ones. She has experienced being taken to a medical facility with concrete floor and with many beds, as if a hospital. During this time, she feels drugged and she has tunnel vision. A tall grey puts a long probe into her brain to stimulate memories. She has been made to interact with animals so they can study her response. Ebens are in charge. They are white, tall, with large, round, dark eyes and 4 long fingers, with knobbly joints on each hand. They are fine-boned with long necks, and they can penetrate our minds. They copy emotional reactions so that they can build synthetic humans that react like humans do. This is a multi-dimensional agenda, and they can stretch time. One of the military men in charge had a crew cut. He was a middle-aged American man and tough. The military have their own agenda, using people's psi abilities for counterintelligence purposes. This takes place at an Air Force base, which is connected to green and yellow reptilians. The reptilians are used to soften abductees up and make them compliant. They psychically terrorize humans. The reptilian is as much a victim sometimes and is just used as a pawn in the project. Not all of them, but some. She was trained in espionage due to her psychic ability. Both ETs and military like how her mind works. And like Belinda Leslie, she says the color green is prevalent when you're around the military. And when you're around ETs, the color blue. So when people are moved in jump rooms, what they see around them is green. The military can zap you with an electronic device and put you out cold. You are immobilized and then under their control. No one ever talks to you or explains to you what you're doing. That's part of the intimidation. So as you can see, there are so many agendas. And, you know, humans are just being used for all of these projects without their permission. Now I'm just trying to think what else I can tell you, because I mean, had so many people tell me things. I had a wonderful phone call from an 88-year-old woman. Emma, I'll call her Emma. I've changed names because I don't want to reveal identities. But I feel it's terribly important that people's stories get out, that people in the public hear what others are going through. Here's a case of another woman who had the most shocking childhood. At age 6 or 7, one night she woke up in her bedroom and felt terribly anxious. It was a clear moonlight night. She saw movement in the corner of her room and identified 4 or 5 very thin beings, about 3 foot tall and androgynous. They had pointy heads and came towards her bed. One of them took one of her arms and she felt as if she was flattened and became quite rigid. Next, they lifted her up and she went straight out of the window, and then they brought her straight back, or that's what she thought. They blocked her memories. She was paralyzed and could not even call out. She could only groan. Her father heard her and came into the room and touched her, and that broke the paralysis. She was terrified and told him it was not a nightmare. The next morning, her mother noticed a mark on her forehead, like a pock mark. And her mother was also very psychic and was very disturbed by what she saw. The pock mark took many years to become less obvious and heal. And she was paralyzed often during encounters. Her mother was abused by a priest as a child and suffered greatly from hatred of herself. She was severely beaten by her grandmother, and as a result of this trauma was incapable of loving her daughter. Now, do you know how many times I've heard that? Where the mother, for some reason, is incapable of loving the child. And that the contactees are often born into families like that. Not always, but certainly quite a lot of the time. Her mother would send her down to the basement where she'd spend much of her day. And her mother would say, "You shouldn't have been born. I didn't want you." When her father became ill in later years, she looked after him, and she also looked after her mother until her death. She suffered with paralysis for years and years. Numerous tests, medical tests, couldn't find any reason for it. And what was lovely about this particular woman, in spite of all her hardships, and she never married or had children, she had the most loving heart, and she couldn't do enough for other people. So it's interesting how these most traumatic experiences can transform someone into becoming this incredibly beautiful human being. I love that, that you don't have to be a victim and stay down. It's up to you to kind of make something of yourself and really make the best of a situation.